This is a commentary about my Five Nights at Freddy's 1 timeline video. Um, I started to work on this because one night I was watching old game theory videos regarding the timelines and the story of Five Nights at Freddy's, and I became very dissatisfied while watching all of them at some point because he kind of went away from the timeline for a while to tell more the story side of it, which I understand. These timeline videos, trying to make a timeline of these games is not easy, and I understand that. But for me, uh, for me, I would better understand the story of Five Nights at Freddy's if I could actually visualize a clear cut timeline of the events as they happen. To me, that's just a better way of trying to understand uh, not only what goes on in the story, but when everything takes place. That way, I have a clear, coherent story going on in my head. Because game theory went away from the timelines for the most part, I decided to try to take it upon myself and write the timelines game by game. So this is the timeline of the first game. Now, during this video, uh, it's funny. I don't like the way I sound with my voice, which is why I'm going to try to keep this as short as possible so I don't have to edit this commentary a whole lot. This is going to be as genuine as possible with little to no cuts, if any. So it's going to be a little bit. So I wanted to do this video to try to explain my process and reasoning of why I decided to do these timeline videos and why I took them game by game by game, only adding to the timeline when we get into the next game. So this will just be a commentary regarding the first video of Five Nights at Freddy's 1 timeline. So I guess let's get into this.
This is the Five Nights at Freddy's timeline. We will be taking this.
Okay, so first off, I decided to do robot voices. Let me turn it up a bit. I can't quite hear it. I decided to do robot voices because, like I said before, I do not like the way that my voice sounds. And I guess that makes these videos kind of boring because after a while they do get kind of boring. But, you know, I'm not a good when it comes to informational videos, because these are informational. I'm not really good at making them very entertaining. So I try my best to get my point across, get the story across, and get the visuals across the best I can, so that way it comes off as somewhat interesting. I could have used my voice, but like I said, I don't even like doing this commentary because I'll have to listen to it later on. So let's get back to it.
Timeline game by game. We will ignore every game or book that comes after the game that we are focusing on. However, we will allow any game that came previously to the game that we are looking at. Now onto the timeline of only the first Five Nights at Freddy's game. The first event in the timeline starts on June 26th, year unknown. According to the first
Okay, so with this timeline right
the timeline
here,
starts on June 20th.
What I originally wanted was for the timeline to be a digital timeline, like drawn out on my phone digitally. But as I got later into the other games and the timeline started getting even bigger and bigger, I learned that I can't just do it all digitally. I can't fit everything onto this small screen. So what I did was later on, I had to just write it down on paper and take a photo of the paper, of the timeline that was on the paper, as I went on. And now you'll notice that a lot of these dates on the first timeline video is wrong. Not every date. Some of them are correct. I'll try to point them out as I remember them. But the ones regarding the missing kids, things that we absolutely know for sure because they're written down inside the game, those are right. Like June 26th, I believe. I believe that's June. That is correct. Anyway, so let's keep going.
6th. Year unknown. According to the first article, 2 kids were seen on camera lured by a man in a mascot costume and were not seen since then. The following morning, according to the second article, 5 kids are now missing and the man has been caught and charged. This took place on June 27th. Year unknown. According to the third article, Freddy's was being threatened with shutdowns due to sanitation violations. Blood was coming from the robots. Month unknown. Day unknown. Year unknown.
Can I just take a minute to say just how ridiculous the Five Nights at Freddy's story is? Just from the first game alone, the fact that this guy, that 5, or at least what we assume is 5, because if you read the articles, it specifically says only 2 kids go missing in one article. But then later on in another article, it says 5 are now missing. But it doesn't say exactly when those other 3 kids were lured into the back room. Like, it points out that 2 kids on one day, on the same day, got lured, but if you notice, those other 3 kids that are part of the 5, we don't know if they were lured on that exact same day that those 2 kids were reported, or if they happened at separate points. Later on, I theorize down the line that, actually, yes, 5 kids go missing at this one location, but some of them are more spread out throughout the timeline. Like, there's the first Golden Freddy victim, yes, is the first victim of Freddy Fazbear's and is a part of the 5 kids, but he doesn't get killed in 1985, he gets killed in 1983. So what I argue is that that even though that takes place a few years before the 85 killings, that kid still is counted as a missing kid in the location. So 5 missing kids altogether. If that makes any sense. I tried to explain that the best I can. So that's just one thing that I wanted to commentate about.
The next event in the timeline was the bite of 87. Phone Guy states that the robots could walk around during the day. However, this bite restricted them to moving around only at night.
Okay, this is a very interesting thing about the bite of 87. FNAF 1, this was before FNAF 2 came out, and we had really no idea, at least for the time being, when Five Nights at Freddy's 1 took place. Not until the very end, where we had to do calculations for the paycheck. So, honestly, I put the bite of 87 right here, because I had no idea at the time whether the bite of 87 took place before or after the 5 kids go missing. Or the 2 kids go missing specifically. There's a lot of question marks around here because, at this point in time, you really don't know. Not until you get later on in the games and they start giving you specific dates, or you can correctly assume the different dates, because of the timeline order of events. So let's keep going.
So just be aware, the characters do tend to want...
Okay, so I try to, number one, I try to keep things interesting by putting Phone Guy in instead of just having a robotic voice throughout the whole thing. But the other reason is because I wanted to call back like to show you the proof of what I said. So that way, if you hear it from Phone Guy himself, you know that I'm telling you the truth. I'm not trying to hide anything from you when it comes to what I'm trying to get across. My point trying to get across. And Phone Guy is a little, not in this game, but later on down the line, he does kind of contradict himself. I think only once, maybe twice. But I think Scott Cawthon has done a pretty good job, keeping Phone Guy's stories and his dialogue consistent with each other. And I'll point out that in my Five Nights at Freddy's 2 timeline commentary, where we get into the inconsistency with Phone Guy, but that's later. Right now, everything's small, and everything is like a self-contained story at the moment.
Under a bit. They're left in some kind of free roaming mode at night. Something about their servos locking up if they get turned off for too long. They used to be allowed to walk around during the day, too. But then there was the bite of 87.
Month unknown. Day unknown. Year 1987. The following event is on April 1st, 1990. This was when America's minimum wage rate increased to about $4 an hour. This is present on Mike's paycheck $120 a week. Mike worked 6 hours times 5 days. He worked equals 30 full hours of work. 120 divided by 30 equals $4 an hour. The next event is Phone Guy's death.
Okay, if you want to be technical with this, I kind of had to give a little leeway because in 1990, the minimum wage was technically $3 and let's just say 60 cents. It was one of those situations where I said, well, if you squint at it and maybe round up, you could technically maybe get away with saying it was in the first event, is in 1990. But as I later learn, going down the road of these timelines and these games, I eventually learned that the first Freddy Fazbear's location, well, the first Freddy Fazbear's location, at least the one in this game specifically, takes place in 1993, which I didn't know at the time. I took a look at everything inside of this game alone and tried to deduce where the wage increase was according to, America's minimum wage history. So that actually brings me to another good point I want to bring up, is that a lot of people, when they theorize about a game, they often look at sources outside of the game itself to help with their theories. And I'm not saying that that's a bad way of going about it. A lot of times that is very helpful, and sometimes you need to do that. But with me, though, I am the kind of, I guess you could say, theorist that believes that if there's anything to look into, it should be within the game itself. And maybe, if the developer didn't get his point across, he tries to explain it down the line, whatever. But I think that with Scott Cawthon, he does a really good job of keeping everything, all the clues and everything, inside of the actual game, and he doesn't have to go outside of the game most of the time to try to give us a clue or give us a hint or try to explain himself. Usually with Scott, he's a very good storyteller. He's very good at this mystery stuff, and he keeps everything that we need inside of his game. So I look to just what the game itself can tell us, and then deduce the story from there. Which is why, not looking at any of the other games, I try to deduce when this takes place according to America's minimum wage history. And this was the best date I thought at the time would work. because of the little information that I had, because I was just looking at the first game. So yeah, I think that's a very good point for me to say going into this. That's kind of my mindset as I'm, working on these theories, the timeline.
On November 4th, 1990. The pre-recorded message states that Phone Guy worked before Mike and that he was finishing up his last week.
I actually.
Said Phone
Okay,
Guy.
okay. So Phone Guy's death being November 4th. I often in my timeline videos, I often get Phone Guy's death, the date of his death wrong. I'm not sure if I got it wrong here, but I often do it in my second, my third, and I think even my fourth timeline video. I kept getting it wrong because I kept forgetting to change it to the right date. I forget exactly what date that was supposed to be, but here's what happened. So, I tried to use the dates that I did know. So, say, we do know from Mike's check that he's working in November, and it says the day that he worked on, that he got his check on, I mean. So I worked backwards. I figured that Phone Guy, at the very least, had to work the week before Mike got the job. So if you think about it like this. Like, the first week, Phone Guy takes the job as night guard, right? And then he dies on a Thursday or Friday. I forget. Let's see. Which day was it on? Was it night? Was it night 4? Night 5? I think it was night 4. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So I think that's a Thursday. He died on a Thursday. How do I know this? Well, because you hear his recorded message on a Thursday. The message where he dies corresponds to the day that you hear it on. So if he recorded that death message on a Thursday, then your player character hears it on a Thursday, if that makes sense. But initially, what I thought was he had died on either the 6th day or the 7th day, probably the 6th day. That's what I thought. Because I thought, well, it's at the end of the week, so it's either on a Friday or Saturday which he dies, in which case they'll need a new employee for Monday. But then I realized that the days which Phone Guy records his messages correspond to the same days of which the player character hears those messages. So the first night, Phone Guy records his first message on Monday. And then when you show up to your Monday job, you hear the first message he recorded on his Monday on your Monday. And, you're kind of with Phone Guy throughout the week. So that's kind of why I got the whole death date with Phone Guy mixed up. I think it's actually supposed to be November 6th, if I remember, which he dies on. But I can't quite remember. Anyway, it's not important to the whole scheme of things. It's just keep in mind that I do believe that Phone Guy died at least a few days to maybe a week, maybe less than a week before Mike takes the job. He had to die in order for Mike to get the job, because they needed help wanted. They needed help. Why? Because their previous night guard, Phone Guy, died. So they need a new security guard. So that's the main point that I want to make with Phone Guy's death, is that, the date may not really matter a whole lot. Just keep in mind that it was right before Mike had to take the job because they needed help.
Said Phone Guy worked before Mike and that he was finishing up his last week.
I actually worked in that office before you. I'm finishing up my last week now, as a matter of fact.
Then he died on his fourth night, presumably on Thursday since most people work Monday through Friday.
Hey, wow, day 4. I knew you could do it. Hey, listen, I may not be around to send you a message tomorrow. It's been a bad night here for me. Hey, do me a favor. Maybe sometime you could check inside those suits in the back room. I always wondered what was in all those empty heads back there. You know. Oh no.
After he died, the business needed to fill his job. Which brings us now to Mike taking the job on November 8th, 1990. Mike works through the week and gets his check on Friday, November 12th, 1990. He works for his overtime paycheck on November 13th, 1990. He works for a final day and gets fired on November 14th, 1990. The fourth article states that Freddy's will be shut down permanently at the end of the year. We can assume this means that it will shut down near December 31st, 1990.
Okay, so I arbitrarily put December 31st because it's literally the last day of the year. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be the last day of the year. You know, Freddy's could have, if this article corresponds to the same location, the same point in time when Mike is working at that location, then it doesn't necessarily have to be specifically November 30th or December 31st. It could have been sometime at the end of November, or it could have been sometime, in the middle of December when it closes. It's just the point is that according to the article, if it's talking about this location at this point in time specifically, then it's at least at some point before the year is up, before the year ends. Now, there is the possibility that that article could have been referring to the same location but at a different point in time. So it wasn't clear to me then because I was just working on the first game and only the first game. But later on down the timeline, we learn, or down the road, we learned that there were multiple different locations, and then there were some repeat locations where the company would close down a location, open up a new one, shut that new one down, and then return to their old location, right? So that article could have been referring to the location back in 1983, not the location in 1993. If that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. But we're not entirely sure. Looking back now, I don't think it matters too much, because whether that article was referring to the same location just in 1983, or if it's referring to, again, the same location but later on down the road in 1993, either one could work. I think specifically it was referring to the location, this location, when it was open from 1983 to 1985. And it could have been referring to, after the blood started coming out of the animatronics because of the missing kids at the time, which is very well possible. It could have been referring to that. But it also works with the same location just in 1993, because the location in 1993, which is the same location that was open back in 1983 through 1985, the location in 1993 does get shut down at the end of the year, or at least at some point not too long after Mike gets fired. Why? How do I know that? Well, it could be because of the article, or it could also be because of Five Nights at Freddy's 3, where we see Purple Guy come back to the boarded up building where it's all run down and it's leaking and dripping water and rain everywhere. Oh, excuse me, I'm tired. And make sure I'm still recording. It would be a nightmare if I was going on and it wasn't recording. So what was I saying? Oh yeah, Purple Guy comes back to the boarded up building. It's boarded up, it's leaking, it's abandoned. So that means that the location was shut down again in 1993 or maybe 1994. Actually, it was shut down in 1993, specifically 1993, and I get this wrong later on, but the reason why is because Fazbear's Frights opens 30 years after the events of Purple Guy getting spring locked. And if you add 1993 plus 30, that's 2023, which is exactly the year that Fazbear Frights happens in. So it couldn't be 1994. It had to have closed down in 1993.
And that is the end of the first game's timeline. Next, we will look at what the second game, and only the second game, adds to the timeline.
Okay, so that's the end. Don't really have anything to say after that. Next commentary will be on the timeline of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, Electric Boogaloo. So I hope that this video does well and that I was able to explain everything as best I could. Now you understand why I do not voice over these timeline videos on my own. You know, now you get why I have a robot do it. So I'm taking a shot at the dark with this, but hopefully that this will turn out good, and maybe I can improve myself in my commentary in the next timeline, next unfortunate events. Okay, that's it. Goodbye.